This is our final meeting for the semester of the IDF group. For those of you that don't know, it's the Interdisciplinary Dialogue Forum. Over the past semester, we've had over 10 presentations every Friday, almost every Friday, with different topics. And I thought that since this is our last week, I would do a quick recap of our previous discussions, because we've had some really interesting talks. And so we began on 10th of September with Becoming Integral, Philosophy for Our Planetary Future with Sam Mickey. Then we moved into Scientific Cosmology and Tibetan Buddhisms, Old and New from Aaron Weiss. Our own Matt Siegel over here had Spiritual Ecologies and the Future of Knowledge. Then from Adam Hudson, student in Social and Cultural Anthropology, we had Engaging Dissent, the Wisdom of One. And we did 2 weeks on integral ecology. The first week was an introduction to integral ecology as a field by Elizabeth McAnally, and then I gave my own presentation on integral ecology the following week. And we had an approach embodying a Gaian consciousness, a practical approach to enchantment. It's probably the most enticing title we had all semester from Kat Snow. We had Josh Halpern's Woof and Wonder, West Coast premiere of his film, sort of documenting his trips, international trips on various organic farms around the world. And today, we're ending with Jamie Socci, The Death of Man, Gender and Identity in the Planetary Era. Woo-hoo. It's a festive title and a festive topic for the holidays. I just want to read you the description so you all know what you're getting into for the next 2 hours or so. Jamie writes, in his 1966 book, The Order of Things, Michel Foucault declared the death of man. By this he meant the end of the conception of the human being as an autonomous individual. This talk explores the categories of identity and gender and how these notions are changing as evidenced through LGBT and non-cisgendered movements. Gender itself is analyzed through three different modes of thought: socio-anthropological, evolutionary biological, and spiritual essentialist. Jamie's going to be addressing questions such as what is gender, what is the source of gender roles, and what is the effect of gender notions on the individual and society. And she's going to try and bring this in terms of our a phrase that we use in PCC sometimes, which is the planetary era, which is the sense that there's an emerging sort of interconnected planetary civilization, and certainly conversations of gender and identity are a big part of what that looks like. So my introduction today for Jamie is unabashedly biased. A big fan of the work that she does. She certainly helped immeasurably putting this program together over the past 15 weeks, getting presenters, helping to facilitate introductions, things like that. And she's a great person to have around, because she's one of those rare people who will not just be able to identify what the problems are, but will actually almost always take action to do something about them. And so it's been a great help to me and a great inspiration to be able to work with her. So I'm very happy to introduce this week Jamie Socci.
Hey, thank you so much for that introduction. And now I'm going to give some gratitude back to you. I really first want to start by thanking Matt Siegel and Adam Robert for all of the help that you guys have both given me with this project. Especially yesterday, the three of us had a 7-hour road trip to LA to see a Whitehead conference, and the entire time they were both great sports, just helping me.
It was 14 hours earlier.
It was 14 hours, that's true. There and back, 14 hours. It was definitely worth it. But I just really want to thank you guys for giving me your feedback and your respect, and really just providing me with inspiration and friendship. And to quote a feminist, since we're talking about gender today, I'll quote Simone de Beauvoir, who in her book, When Things of the Spirit Comes First, one of her characters laments that I was searching for giants and I found only men. And I just want to tell you guys thank you, and I do feel like I'm walking with giants when I'm with you guys and talking about all of our crazy philosophical ideas. So thank you. So let's get right into it. So the topic today, the death of man. Despite the title, this isn't some man-hating she-woman man-haters club or anything like that. Actually, I really think it's important to open up the dialogue about gender and sexuality, to extend it to not just be about women and about sexual deviance, but really that it's something that we all deal with and that we live through in our lives. And if we're ever going to move forward, that we really need to open the dialogue up to men as well. So even though, and again, in a few points in the talk, I'll be talking about a lot of the negative aspects of gender, and I really just want to reiterate that I'm not suggesting anywhere that we need to get rid of gender categories, nor that we can, but really it's just trying to suggest a way for how to create more freedom for people to express themselves. So for my background is in anthropology before I became a student here at CIIS. And I studied under a cultural anthropologist named Deborah Curtis. And her specialty was gender and sexuality and the effects of pop culture on gender and sexuality. So she really changed the way that I interpreted and interacted with the world, specifically about gender. And one of the best things that she told me about anthropology was that one role in anthropology is to tell the stories of people who would have no voice. And so that's what really drew me in. And this idea of telling stories and listening to people's stories I found to be incredibly powerful. One evidence of this, soon after I graduated, I started a small group of women to help them to cultivate their sexual health. And it basically came about because I realized that these young women who I went to school with and worked with were basically like handing out blowjobs like Tic Tacs, and none of them had ever had orgasms before. Not that I have anything against blowjobs or Tic Tacs. So the whole point of the group was basically I just got some people together who I knew had really healthy sex lives and had a lot of confidence. And we got together with these young girls and just opened up dialogue. And through sharing stories, people were really able to feel more comfortable with their bodies and feel more comfortable with sex. And it was one of the most fulfilling projects that I've ever been engaged with in my life, for sure. For anybody who's interested in being a teacher, if you want to be a really successful teacher, teaching anybody about how to have good sex, you're pretty much guaranteed good students. So I recommend it. So the main focus of this talk is to study the discourse and experience of gender categories in the United States and kind of within the West, but I want to keep it on that. I'm not going to propose any kind of transcendent reality of gender. So, defining gender roles. So what are the gender roles that we live in our society? And for this, I'm going to read a few excerpts from this awesome book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Not sure if anyone's ever read it. So this is kind of for those who don't know, it's an advice book on how different sexes can interact with each other. So, just read a few. Without awareness that we are supposed to be different, men and women are at odds with each other. We expect the opposite sex to be more like ourselves. Men mistakenly think that expect women to think, communicate, and react the way that men do. Women mistakenly expect men to feel, communicate, and respond the way women do. Recognizing and respecting these differences dramatically reduces confusion when dealing with the opposite sex. And in the book, he refers to men as Martians and women as Venusians. So Martians value power, competency, efficiency, and achievement. They are always doing things to prove themselves and develop their power and skills. Their sense of self is defined through their ability to achieve results. They experience fulfillment primarily through success and accomplishment. In contrast, Venusians have different values. They value love, communication, beauty, and relationships. They spend a lot of time on supporting, helping, and nurturing one another. Their sense of self is defined through their feelings and the quality of their relationships. They experience fulfillment through sharing and relating. So there's another, One of the biggest differences between men and women is how they cope with stress. Men become increasingly focused and withdrawn, while women become increasingly overwhelmed and emotionally involved. He feels better by solving problems, while she feels better by talking about problems. Talking is one thing that came up over and over again in the book, this idea of women talk a lot, and that's one of the issues between men and women. So, some practical advice from John Gray. Ways to score points with a woman. Give her a hug. Ask her specific questions about her day. Give her 20 minutes of unsolicited quality attention. Don't read the newspaper or be distracted by anything else. If she washes your socks, turn your socks right side out so she doesn't have to. Be patient when she is sharing. Don't look at your watch. And just so you know, when men are scoring points with women, everything's pretty much the same. So no matter what you do, you just get 1 point. Now, men, on the other hand, are very different. They give points based on the quality of what you've done for them. So for this one, there's things like, let's see. If he forgets to pick something up and she says, "It's okay, would you do it next time you're out?" instead of complaining, you can get 10 to 20 points. If she really enjoys having sex with him, that's 10 to 40 points, depending. And if she shares negative feelings in a centered way without blaming, rejecting, or disapproving, it's another 10 to 40 points. So, basically, even though it seems kind of silly, like, these are the dominant categories that we live through. This is how most people experience their gender, and it's how most people expect you to act based on your physical appearance. So even though it basically, it's portraying and reflecting notions that are already out there in culture. So these notions are obvious. Women are more nurturing and emotional, men are more rational and aggressive, and this kind of goes back to the idea of marked and unmarked categories. I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with that. Elizabeth Allison talks about that a lot in her work. And basically it's the idea that we define people through the abnormal. So that the the unmarked categories is what is normal, and then the unmarked categories are things like women or sexual deviants or children or anything that isn't considered the norm of whatever context you're talking about. So masculine, the category of masculinity, is normally thought to be this unmarked category. And these are characteristics within our society that are more dominant and also seen as more valuable in society. So even though traditionally this is kind of why the thought about gender and sexuality is normally talked about in terms of women, because it's been women, because men are dominant in society, obviously it's women who are speaking up against their own repression. But the main thing to remember is that these categories really repress all of us. It's not just an issue with women. Just because the category of man says that it's more valued in culture doesn't mean that all men can fit into that category and then integrate easily into society. It's still putting this pressure on men that they have to be a certain way as well. So it's these standards that we're meant to fulfill. So additionally, we have pressure to conform to the shadow side of these gender stereotypes. A few points about this is that men's bodies are often seen as weapons, as aggressive, as something that needs to be controlled. Men have to rein it in, whereas women kind of lack agency. They're victims of indirect violence, or like the myth of Helen of Troy. They're kind of the seductress, and all of these things happen around them. But they're never really the agents of the action. And as we'll see later, and as you know from your experience, people do not typically fall into these categories. Yet, stereotypes at the same time do correlate with the majority of people that we interact with. So there's some validity to stereotypes, but at the same time, when you get down to the individual basis, it really varies. And part of this is because we, as people, we participate in the reproduction of our own oppression, so that we take on these identities and then we act in the way that we're expected to act, and through that we keep producing these stereotypes and then in turn have pressure to live by them. But these processes aren't linear. There's a cycle of production of our actions and of the stereotypes that we're living through. So it kind of gives hope of how we can move forward. So now I want to talk about a few of the discourses on gender. And this part I really wanted to devote a lot more time to, but I'm just going to kind of go through a few things really quickly. I wanted to talk about the essentialist view, the biological view, and then the cultural view. But really, I started to see there's a lot of similarities between the biological view and the essentialist view, or the biological view is an essentialist view. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the essentialist views and then move into the rest of the presentation. So basically, essentialist theories try to explain inherent properties of things, shared characteristics, universals, and meanings that can be applied to all people within a certain group. So this is evident in a lot of religious traditions. I grew up in a pretty strict religious background, and there were certainly women couldn't wear pants. We were taught that we were supposed to be submissive if we were ever going to find a husband, things like that. So it's pretty obvious in really fundamentalist religions. Also in the metaphysics of many philosophers, including Hegel and Jung. And I'm going to read one brief excerpt from Jung. And I definitely have a sort of love-hate relationship with him. I think he gets a lot of things right. So I mean, he does talk about the pressure to conform to these social rules are often the causes of neuroses. And he gives the example of the classic strong man who, when he goes home privately, he falls apart. So he does talk about that, and yet he still does very much promote the idea of an essential quality of men and women. And this can be seen in his anima and animus theory. So he says things like, talking about the interplay between men and women, if the woman happens to be pretty, these animus opinions have for the man something rather touching and childlike about them, which makes him adopt a benevolent, fatherly, professional manner. But if the woman does not stir his sentimental side, and competence is expected of her rather than appealing helplessness and stupidity, then her animus opinions irritate the man to death. And then later he says, the conscious attitude of woman is in general far more exclusively personal than that of man. Her world is made up of fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, husbands and children, and the rest of the world consists likewise of family who nod to each other but are in the main interested essentially in themselves, whereas the man's world is the nation, the state, business concerns, etc. So even though I think for a lot of us, some people may resonate with that, for a lot of us it definitely feels inherently wrong. The idea that what he's saying is probably wrong doesn't necessarily disprove essentialism, but I think that we kind of have to be a little more discriminating when reading certain things. Then we have the medical explanation, which is another type of essentialist view. It's not the same as these religious or metaphysical explanations, but they explain differences based on anatomy and based on endocrinology or hormones. So there's a lot of correlations between hormonal fluctuations or specific hormones like estrogen and progesterone for women and testosterone for men, and these attachments of aggressiveness with testosterone and passiveness with estrogen. And there's a lot of medical evidence out there to show those correlations. But also we kind of have these expectations first, and then we interpret it through those. So then Evolutionary Biology is the next one I want to talk about, and I don't know if anybody's ever read this book, The Naked Ape, by Desmond Morris, but he talks about how current sexual binarism resulted because man had to go out and hunt, and then the females had to stay home and rear children. And then similarly, Leonard Shlain, who wrote Sex, Time, and Power, and is it The Alphabet and
the Goddess?
The Alphabet and the Goddess, right. So he talks about how sexual norms come from the selective pressures and the female's ability to refuse sex, so that the actual, our anatomies and the trajectory of our evolutionary history was formed because of sexual selection. So basically, all of these views are assuming that norms are natural, that they are biological, and then that they can be explained by biological and empirical data. And one thing about that is the idea that Adam and I were talking about yesterday, this idea of adaptive fitness versus viability fitness. And the thought of this is that once the main pressures are taken off, the main selective pressures are taken out of the picture, and we're able to, there's no strong selective pressures, so variability increases, basically. If we're not needing to evolve in a certain trajectory, then there's kind of more variability, and so because of that, you can't necessarily explain certain behaviors that humans exhibit based solely on selective pressures, because we've enjoyed a long time of not having a lot of pressure put on us, so that we are able to kind of vary a little more. So the limitations of these knowledge. First, that in all science, we tend to start with our assumptions, and then we rationally and empirically explain them. For those of you familiar with Edgar Morin, he talks about science as a process of selecting and rejecting certain data based on what we already believe. And one thing in Morris, when he's talking about sexual binarism, he says, great variability exists both between and within societies. The only solution is to take average results from large samples of the most successful societies. The small, backward, and unsuccessful societies can largely be ignored. They may have fascinating and bizarre sexual customs, but biologically speaking, they no longer represent mainstream evolution. Indeed, it may very well be that their unusual sexual behavior has helped turn them into biological failures as social groups. Most of the detailed information we have available stems from a number of painstaking studies carried out in recent years in North America, and is based largely on that culture. So basically they're taking, as you can see here, they're ignoring any kind of anomaly and saying that these dominant structures are what's natural. And so the rest of his book is studying sexual dimorphism through that lens of this is what's normal and dominant culture is what's natural. And even though, this book was written in the 60s, so the language in new studies isn't exactly that explicit, but it's still subtly implicit that this is the processes that they're going through. And another problem with science and knowledge is this misguided search for fundamentalism, and it comes out in other areas besides gender, but this idea that we can kind of find a baseline of what's real and then build up from there, just like in physics, like as if we can figure physics out, then everything else will make sense. But that's really not what's fundamental. Just because we can reduce something doesn't mean that it is the basis for which everything else is built. So really, self-experience is primary to everything else. And everything else that we can explain through exploring other processes can definitely enrich those experiences, but we can't really reduce it to that. So Michel Foucault talks about scientia sexualis, and he juxtaposes that with this idea of ars erotica, which we'll get to later. But basically this is the idea of studying sexuality through this medical and scientific lens, and this process of producing truth about sexuality. What happened in the beginning in the 18th and 19th centuries, we had this real increase in scientific inquiry, and out of that came theories from biological reproduction and the medicalization of sexuality. And out of this came the creation of cultural norms from this process, our modern cultural norms. And inherent in this is Foucault's theory of knowledge as power, and that is the idea that people that have the knowledge have the power over others. And this is kind of like the authority of the experts. So the scientists, the people in the medical fields, they're the experts, and then they impart their knowledge that they've gleaned from study onto everybody else. Anne Fausto Sterling also talks about this. She talks about how science and the medical field make judgments about what's normal and abnormal based on cultural assumptions. And of course, these things break down with anything that deviates from the norm, and they're seen as neuroses. So, those are the essentialist views, and now I want to kind of move into the cultural views. And there's, my knowledge on this subject is completely inadequate, and I'm really hoping for some great conversation afterward. But definitely, there's just so much literature out there on culture, and one thing I haven't really studied at all is queer theory, just like very little, and I think that from the little bit that I have studied, it kind of is opening a lot more doors, so I won't be able to talk much about that. But just basically on the basic influence of culture. So often we kind of try to reduce culture to just sets of behaviors and kind of have this idea of essentialism versus naturalism, and then nature versus nurture. We have this idea that nurture is what culture is. So we just kind of reduce it to behavioral or material explanations. And some do use it like this, but for the most part, culture is really viewed as an ecological process. It's an embeddedness. So activities, ideas, and environment that we live through and share, that's what culture is. And again, to go back to Fausto Sterling, she distinguishes said that the distinction between culture and biology eventually breaks down, so that biology and culture aren't at all mutually exclusive. They both work together. And a lot of times people don't really think, especially as counterculturals and rebels in this room, we don't really think that culture affects us. But it works invisibly. That's how it works. So inevitably, we're always going to be embedded in it. And if you want to discover how it's working in your own life, just ask yourself what is most logical and what is most natural to you, and that's probably where your cultural assumptions are coming from. So when it comes to gender and sexuality, we peg minorities and abnormalities as, we peg minorities as abnormalities, and we attribute the majority as natural. So we can't transcend culture. It is part of our inheritance, but understanding it can help us to be part of the creation process. So with gender, one of the biggest issues is identity. For gender, we all try to self-identify as something. And I want to talk about a couple of people with identity. First is Charles Taylor. He wrote Sources of the Self and what's his other book?
Secular Age.
The Secular Age. So he talks a lot about identity. Basically, he tries to analyze how the modern self came from historical processes, but these historical processes are always connected to morals, so moral codes continually superseding one another. And for him, identity is inherently moral. So it's always right versus wrong, natural versus unnatural, and this is a process that we go through to define ourselves and then define others. So our identity, we're always taking on what's natural, what's normal, and then we're shunning the other as not. So we have this, from the Industrial Revolution, we have this idea of the self as being an autonomous individual. And that's embedded in these values that came from the changing lifestyles from the Industrial Revolution, like the mastery of nature, nationalism and isolationism due to globalism. So we really have this very strong sense of self tied to all of these processes. So for Foucault, he talks about how society simultaneously became individual as it became normalizing. So this goes back to the idea of the Scientia Sexualis. And he says that new methods of power are not ensured by right, but by technique, not by law, but by normalization, not by punishment, but by control, methods that are employed on all levels and in forms that go beyond the state and its apparatus. And he says this in Discipline and Punishment. So he talks about how individuals and individual rights actually became an ally of these power processes. And at the center of this is man. Man is the center of knowledge. So no longer do we have God as the center of knowledge, but man is the center of knowledge. And he's also both the subject and object of knowledge. So so this is kind of where Foucault got his idea of the death of man. As Nietzsche had declared the death of God, Foucault is saying, okay, man as the center of things now, eventually that's going to die as well. And even though sometimes Foucault can seem a little dark, he does say that powers are constantly changing through resistance. So identity works in subtle ways, and it's always bound up with society and morality, just as Foucault and Taylor point out. And it's also what we hold most precious and most private. So just like Morin's idea of science being a process of selecting and rejecting data, so is our identity. It's this process of selecting and rejecting the things that we come in contact with. And because it's also very moral, there's really strong emotion and passions tied to it. So this is why the anything that challenges gender is really challenging people's identity as well. So that's why there's so much resistance to it. So the other aspects of cultural theory are these ideas of institutions and symbolic interactionism. And this is kind of the macro view and the micro view. So identity is really formed through institutions. So institutions are historical patterns of rights, powers, responsibilities, and rules. Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, said that the most profound decisions about justice are not made by individuals as such, but by individuals thinking within and on behalf of institutions. So there's this reciprocal nature of institutions. So gender is an institution. Obviously there's government institutions. There's the institution of marriage. So it's not like a corporate identity like we might think of as institutions, but it's these powerful ideas. I'll just read one excerpt about it. So in our life with other people, we are engaged continuously through words and actions in creating and recreating the institutions that make life possible. This process is never neutral, but is always ethical and political, since institutions live or die by the ideas of right and wrong. Conversely, while we in concert with others create institutions, they also create us. They educate us and inform us, especially through the socially enacted metaphors they give us, metaphors that provide normative interpretations of situations and actions. So, again, even though that this is a real constraining aspect on the individual, it's also an enabling aspect once we learn how these institutions are made. But oftentimes we think that if we just change people's minds about something, then behaviors are going to change. But there's not exactly that direct correlation of this is what I believe and now I'm going to manifest this reality. Really, we're still living through these processes of institutions, and if we really want change, we need change on the institutional level as well. So in the macro, for symbolic interactionism, instead of dealing with the bigger ideas, symbolic interactionism is the idea of just this one-on-one basis, so that everything that I come into contact with, every conversation, every action that I perform has symbol and meaning attached to it. So meaning is elicited through these interactions. Therefore, when we define ourselves, we're defining ourselves by the way that this person interacted with me. I'm defining myself based on my material objects, so that all of these actions are actually a language that are helping us to define ourselves. So basically this also goes back to Morin, his idea of the self-auto-eco reorganization, kind of has a word that can keep growing larger and larger. But it's this idea that we're living in this process, and there are all these processes happening together. So it's not just so simple of linear change. So also with this is, I don't know if anyone who heard Adam's talk, he talked about media ecology. And I'm not very familiar with media ecology, but I'll kind of steal some of its ideas and call it media landscape. But it's basically going by this idea of symbolic interactionism, that what we are producing in the material world is also coming back and creating us as well. So the landscape that we live in, this environment that we live in, the advertisements, the buildings, and all of that, even though we made them, they're also producing us. So in advertising, there's been a lot of studies done, and one that I'll read for you, this one had to do just with words. So they did an analysis of the difference in products that were being geared towards men than products being geared towards women. And some of them are pretty obvious. So from Men's Health, this is an ad for a Nissan, for a car. And it shows the picture of the car, and it says, "It doesn't have a feminine side to get in touch with. The new Nissan Frontier, factory installed, supercharged, V6, 210 horsepower, aggressive new design. If it had a chest, it'd be hairy."
Oh.
So again, even though there's somebody making these, they're going on the ideas of our cultural norms, and then they're still coming back and informing our identity. Another thing is films. Obviously, films give us a lot of ideas about cultural norms, and they're really emulated by youth especially, but all people. In one study that I did, I interviewed a lot of people about sex in films. I interviewed specifically women, and the idea was to find out why people emulated sex scenes within film. And what I was expecting to find was people talking about the actual act, about, oh, this position looked fun and I've never done that. But what everybody talked about was how the women looked, was their bodies. Everyone said, well, yeah, sex is good because look at, she's very skinny, she has a perfect body, big breasts, all of those things. So I was really surprised that there would somehow be this connection between how a person looked and how much pleasure was going to be derived from the act of sex. So this goes back to another idea of Michel Foucault, where he talks about this transition from people being a subject of pleasure to being an object of desire. So you can clearly see this illustrated, that when these young girls that I was interviewing were having sex, they were receiving their pleasure from the other person wanting and desiring them, as opposed to actually feeling good because of the physical act that they were involved in. And it probably affects women, or at least in the literature, it affects women a lot more than it does men, but men are definitely also viewed as objects of desire as well. And we'll get back to being a subject of pleasure later. There's hopefully some kind of guidance that we have. So another way that gender plays out, a couple years ago I was living in Florida, and most of my friends were guys, and there would always be those moments in the conversation where they would either quiet down, or I wasn't allowed to hear certain things, and it would always be kind of a joke. Well, there are things that you don't get to hear. So the one night I was really bothered by it, and we were out at a bar, so I decided that there should be some kind of rite of passage that I should be able to go through to have access to this information. So we came up with what was known for the rest of the summer as the man list, and on that list was shotgunning a beer, drinking a shot of Captain, it was mostly drinks, Jameson on the rocks, pee standing up, and eating pussy. I got through 4 of those. So I
couldn't be standing up.
I attempted. So what this example kind of points to is this idea of secret knowledge. That it's not just about there's this gender and there's that gender, but that these genders have knowledge that we don't have access to. And this kind of plays into the idea of the erotic quality of knowledge exchange. Foucault and others have this idea that all knowledge exchange is inherently sexual. And this kind of ties back to Foucault's idea of knowledge and power and the pleasure that's derived from these power games. So he talks about that these sites of power have enormous sexual tension, like doctor and patient, student and teacher, parent and child, priest and penitent. So even the act of sex itself, seen from this way, is this act of knowledge exchange. Because in American society, we're constantly clothed. Clearly, there are things that men will not talk about in front of women, and vice versa. So it's only through this act of sex that we're actually able to come in contact with human beings, other human beings, and have access to the knowledge of what is their body like, what are their thoughts like, things like that. So another point to illustrate this is a senior in college. I had a conversation with a few men, and it came out that they didn't know that there was a vagina and a urethra. They thought that women urinated out of their vaginas as seniors in college. So clearly the secrets that we keep and this secret knowledge is definitely pervasive there. So now I just want to talk about the new gender movements, and I don't have a lot of information on those as well, unfortunately, but clearly we're seeing that there's a lot more political voice in people who aren't in this unmarked category of sexual normalcy. So we have the LGBT, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender movements. And one thing that's happening within these is that there's a lot of variations of this traditional LGBT. The one thing that's commonly added is a Q for questioning, C for curious, intersex, transsexual, transvestite, pansexuality, omnisexuality, fetish communities, and allies. And then another one is SGL, which is same gender loving, which is something that came out of African American gay movements. So what this is saying is that as people are starting to come out and express themselves in other ways that aren't typically considered normal, that all of a sudden we're seeing a lot of variations. I think that this is pointing to the idea that it's not so easy to categorize people within these structures. A couple that I especially liked, I'm not sure if I wrote it down here. One was gender squishy. Anyone's heard that? Olivia doesn't like that one. It's got kind of like a playful tone to it of just purposely defying standard gender roles, and a similar one called gender fuck, which is purposely going out and presenting in a mocking way a different gender than your own. So those are kind of the more fun ones, and they seem to have a bit of a free spirit to them. So this kind of comes to the idea of should we have a label or shouldn't we have a label? And for me, personally, I would always think like we should try to move away from these labels, because even though people are being empowered by coming out in various ways, they're still then being constrained by the new identities and rules that they're taking on. But at the same time, having this labels also gives people a sense of solidarity with other people who are different as well, and it also gives a political voice to people who are trying to make changes within our structures. So this is kind of a big issue, which I hope will come up in the conversation as well. So for me, other ways of finding a way beyond this, and I'm almost done, and I'd really like to just kind of, again, open it up to conversation. One way I find of moving beyond this is through comedy. I think that as much as we can mock these gender norms in any way that we can, it's kind of a way for us to relieve any kind of pain that we might be feeling about it, but also really mocking this system that's oppressive. So ars erotica is this idea of Foucault's, and this is again what he juxtaposed against Scientia Sexualis, and ars erotica is erotic art, and it's basically this idea of, instead of studying empirically sexuality, that we react to it, because art is a reaction. It's not saying this is how it is, it's this is how I'm reacting to it. And he talks about this coming out of Eastern traditions a lot, that there's not this systematic study, but there's a lot of art about sexuality and gender. And then his idea of being a subject of pleasure. And so there's a lot of, everybody has to find their own ways of cultivating that and kind of rejecting this idea of being an object of desire and moving back into that. Definitely anything involving touch and being present in that is going to move into that. And even Foucault talks about laughter and mocking and joking and viewing sex as a fun game, as a way of us coming back in touch with ourselves as being a subject of pleasure. So it's kind of becoming a gender squishy fuck, whatever you want to do. Moving into those labels or moving away from the other labels. Did you happen to find that?
Yeah.
Okay. So why this is really important now, some of us may or may not feel, thank you so much, some of us may or may not feel oppressed by the category of gender from what society is placing on us. It might be fine, and that's absolutely fine for you. This isn't trying to suggest that you should change your views at all. But the reason that it's important is because other people are feeling oppressed. And if we're moving into a space where we want to be able to participate in other people expressing themselves, and we want to move to a place where we're treating each other as brothers and sisters, then we need to be sensitive to the fact that people want to express themselves in many different ways, and that these categories are oppressive. It's been in the news a lot lately about many young people who are taking their lives because they're facing pressure at school of being bullied because of their sexual identity or because they're confused. And so it's a really big deal, and for me I think it's a moral imperative for us to play with these notions and ideas, and to definitely open ourselves up into other ways of being. So before we go into discussion, I just want to end by reading a passage. Del Mernon, who is a student here and the creator of two organizations, one called Gender Free from All and one called Trans Enough. For a class that we had together, we had to write or create a ceremony around something that wasn't, that we had no outlet for, that wasn't yet a rite of passage in our society. And so he wrote a transgender rite of passage, and I think it's beautiful, and it's great for I think everybody. I think it's kind of illustrating the pain that people can feel, and illustrating a way for us to kind of open up to each person's creativity. So, we come together today to celebrate, honor, hold, and support your new life. We recognize the complexity that is gender, while also recognizing the complexity that goes into living a life that openly and honestly challenges the simplicity of our culturally imposed binary gender system. It takes bravery to choose to walk this path, regardless of whether gender is born or chosen. We remain a culture reactive to fear of the unknown and the different. We continue to see a rise in transphobic hate crimes. These cowardly acts demonstrate the need for greater activism, outreach, and education. This also demonstrates the need for a greater community of supportive allies for our transgender, genderqueer, intersex, and non-gender conforming communities. This is why we are here today. We are here to demonstrate our commitment to you. We are here with a promise to educate ourselves about your struggles, to ask the questions we need to ask to better understand and open our minds. We are dedicated to being better allies in our communities, both personally and politically. But most importantly, we are here as your family. We promise to love you and act as part of your support system. We promise to never claim to know what it is like to go through your personal struggles, but will always be ready to lend a hug and a listening ear. Tolerance is a deceptive virtue. I do not wish to belittle tolerance, but simply to recognize that it is not a real response to the challenging facts of difference. Tolerance can enable coexistence, but it is certainly no way to be good neighbors. In fact, tolerance often tends to stand in the way of engagement. And it goes on a little more, but I'll just end it there. So, thank you guys. Anyone have questions, responses?
Can I just say one thing real quick for those of you that don't know? It's just good to know what the timing and format is. We usually run an hour for the presentation, which we just did, and then another hour for discussion. So if you're just wondering how long this goes on, we end at 8:30, and the format is free discussion either to Jamie or to anybody else who brings up a point you'd like to pick up on.
Yes.
I'm just curious, do you know how Foucault defines power?
Well, it seems like such a basic question. I think it's just the ability to exert authority over others. But for him, knowledge and power are almost synonymous. They go together.
Okay, there is a question on this. I just also wanted to commend the way that you were able to hold all this together, and without like offering your own like prescriptive or moral imperative to us, but just allowing us to sit with the complexity of it was really helpful for me. But what I find really interesting is this binary opposition that we often see between biology and culture, or nature and culture. Mm-hmm. And I am all for trying to make that binary opposition more of a continuity or a continuous gradient of some kind. But then it seems like the reason that we get so excited about gender and sex as human beings, as cultural animals, is because of the sort of variability that's opened up when the selective pressures are lowered, like you were saying. Mm-hmm. So sex takes on this great significance for us, and I think even for biological creatures, sex is one of two ways maybe that animals are able to really transcend themselves. Sex and death being the other one. And so it's no surprise that like human culture gets so hung up on sex, human religion especially, because it's concerned with transcendence, and sex is one of the ways that we do that we transcend our individual like skin boundaries, you know. Mm-hmm. And it seems like that whatever culture and nurture is adding to biology or nature, that it's about this movement towards more or increasing consciousness and self-consciousness. And critical cultural theory, I think, is an example of us coming to more consciousness of the way in which even science can project cultural biases onto what it thinks are objective facts about the biological world. But I wonder if you were saying that it would be better if we were to identify with the subject of pleasure, with our own inner experience of being pleasured, than objectifying ourselves, seeing ourselves as objects of other people's desire. Mm-hmm. And what do you think about that difference between being the subject of pleasure and the object of desire being an important one for our sort of evolution or development of our consciousness? And that if we just got rid of this ability to objectify ourselves, we'd actually be becoming less conscious of how it is that we are in the world amongst others. You know? Mm-hmm. So is it a matter of getting rid of this experience of being an object of desire, or just finding a new way of relating our inner experience of ourselves with how others reflect ourselves back to ourselves?
Right. So for object of desire, I think that it can sound like self-reflexive thought, mm-hmm. which is something different. In Foucault's definition of objective desire, it's more about taking on an identity and identifying as an object of desire as opposed to a subject of pleasure. Okay. I think that we definitely need a sense and an interplay of objectivity and subjectivity to whatever extent we're able to have that experience. But yeah, it's really about taking on that identity and not being able to derive pleasure outside of that.
Right. Okay. So in the extreme case, when you can't, you're sort of stuck in a particular objectified identity and unable to experience pleasure outside of that, is what Foucault was meaning, I guess.
Right, exactly. And I think like the illustration of these women who were experiencing sexual pleasure only from the way that they were perceiving the men to be perceiving them.
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
I was curious, we talked before about this theory, I believe the hot tubs that came up, but I was, I was curious. You mentioned the women that you worked with. Would you describe this as the majority of women as objects of desire and not subjects of pleasure? I mean, with your anthropologist, did you talk at all about what percentage you think of women hold that category versus subjects of pleasure?
Yeah, that's really hard, especially in anthropology and in those kinds of methods where we're extracting that kind of data. It's very like one-on-one and it's small scale. So you wouldn't talk about bigger populations with ideas like this. And I don't think that there's a lot of literature or studies out there yet. I would say that it's my personal opinion that this is most people's experience in America, the experience of most women. I think most women that I have talked to have at least gone through a period of feeling like that. So I would guess so. Yes.
Majority of women, yes.
I think it's a really common problem. And one way to analyze that without doing like ethnographic research would be to read the literature of pop culture, like magazines, analysis of sex advice in magazines. And you can see that a lot of women are doing similar things, are having problems reaching orgasm, are, there are a lot of issues around sex when it comes to women, and the literature that they're going to are these magazines, and they're not exactly the most helpful. But
so during the trans section, you were talking a lot about violence towards people who don't fit the sexual norm. Mm-hmm. And I've definitely come to see that it's true just by looking around the world and also by reading different things. I mean, Morris definitely mentions sexuality and sexual identity as being the cause for different conflicts within like tribes and specific groups. But I guess what I'm wondering is if it's us trying to figure out, us being scared about our own gender identity that's causing this. It's usually, homophobia is, it's a fear of gay people because you're scared that you're gay. It's usually the way that it works out. Right. So if the reason that the violence is happening is because we can't figure out what our actual sexuality is or be comfortable with it, what would you suggest using to explore that other than labels? Because I agree that labels are not a very good tool and they can often lead to negative things, but at the same time there needs to be some way of discussing, some way of communicating and feeling connected with other people. Do you have, any thoughts on that maybe?
Yeah. The label, no label debate is a really big one, and I don't think that there's any simple answer to it. I certainly don't have an answer to it. Obviously, there's the harmful aspects of any kind of box. No matter how liberated you may feel moving from one box to another box, you're still kind of, when people hear these words, it doesn't just say, this is the kind of sexuality I'm expressing. It also connotes a lot of other things. And so suddenly people have these expectations of you, and a lot of times people are living into those expectations as well. So I don't really have any advice of transcending them. I would say I would try to resist them as much as I can for my own personal life, but at the same time, I definitely respect the need to have them, again, for political movements and for people to have a political voice and to have some kind of connection of solidarity. So I would hope that we can move into a place where we're all a lot more accommodating and we're allowing a lot more spaciousness of people to express themselves, and then maybe the need to have these labels will reduce a little bit. But yeah, the only thing I have is this idea of moving into comedy and parody and any way of I would say just expressing yourself and allowing others to express themselves.
I just want to comment a little bit on when you're talking about maybe people bringing up aspects of queer theory. And so one of the things that I've read a lot about and done some stories about it as a journalist is the idea of homophobia as a weapon of sexism, which is the title of a book by Suzanne Farr, who's a great writer on this topic. And so she really takes it, I mean, there's definitely the aspect you just brought up about the internal homophobia that's out of fear of one's own sexuality. But then there's also the reinforced sort of cultural aspects of homophobia, where if you look at hate crimes against gay men and lesbians, they're really, the kinds of crimes that are performed against each of those groups of people are very, very different. You know, you have sort of against lesbians, what men do is want to fuck them. You know, like, I'm going to put you in the place you belong, which is to be an object for men. You don't have men attacking other gay men that way. What they do when they attack gay men is beat them up, right? So they want to, you know, enforce this sort of manhood thing on gay men. So so then the homophobia, as it's expressed in violence, is really about reinforcing sex roles. You know, reinforcing gender roles, and the language that goes along with it is all about that too. Like when you're talking about being an object of desire versus a subject of pleasure. This past couple of weeks, I've been editing all the stories that are coming out of the preliminary hearing on that rape case in Richmond High School a year ago in October, which was a really, really horrible case. And I won't try to tell you details because it's pretty gruesome, but one of the things that has come out about it is a lot of the language that the guys were using that night was all about how she should be pleased and she should be, she should feel great at how she performed, you know, or at the fact that she was given an opportunity to perform, you know, these various different acts. So again, it's like violence, the violence that gets expressed. Well, that's one of the things about covering rape trials that I really believe it's really important to separate sexuality from violence in the coverage, because if you read a lot of coverage of rape trials, it sounds like pornography. You know, people write as if they're writing pornography, and I don't think it should be written as if it were pornography. I think it should be written as if it were brutality, which is what it is. But anyway, so violence expressed in this way that uses sexual acts also is often done in a way to reinforce some kind of role and reinforces the woman as this object of desire. So anyway, I just want to bring that up because in talking about what are the cultural norms and what's outside of the cultural norm and how do we interact with that, I think we cannot possibly overestimate the extent to which those norms are embedded really deeply in all sorts of aspects. So it's embedded in our laws, embedded in our, you know, what a crime is and how we define that, embedded in all these different ways, expressions of crime, you know, and given that, I think one of the ways that we can sort of